149. Amos, looking at chapter 7, the next three verses, 4, 5, and 6. And we're going to be looking at visions number 2 and 3. Number 2 is going to look similar. Number 3 is going to look quite different. Let's have a go at it. Let's look at these three verses. Amos 7, 4 through 6. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. So this is Amos' second vision. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the green deep, the great deep, and devoured the land. That was some kind of fire, all right. Verse 5, then I cried out, Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He's so small. So there is Amos again intervening on behalf of the northern kingdom. So the Lord relented, and we've been through this. This will not happen either, the sovereign Lord said. So this is the second time Amos has intervened in what God proposed as a judgment. At least that's what we'd assume. It was, of course, a vision, and God has not spoken to this point. He just showed him the vision. Amos made his assumptions and intervened, and in both cases, God relented and said, okay, I'm not going to do that. This was a vision with the terms showed me, or which really says caused me to see. This came from God, showing God's initiative by revelation. Again, you don't figure out things by God unless He reveals sufficient information for you to do it. A description, we assume, as did Amos, that this was some form of judgment that God had proposed, not decreed, but proposed. Amos' prayer, his intercession on behalf of the northern kingdom, again, essentially the same kind of intervention that he had in vision number 1 with the locusts and the drought. God's response? Well, again, he said, okay, I'll repent or relent, or I simply won't bring this to pass. This vision it must have been of total destruction by fire, but it also could have signaled drought. Joel 1, verses 19 and 20, in that particular case, the fire signified drought. So it's possible that's what God was saying here again, but a drought from a different perspective. It was severe as it eats up the land and the sea. And of course, it was beyond man's ability to stop or to control. That wasn't new. Amos had used fire as a symbol in the divine judgments of the 8 nations back in chapters 1 and 2. If you want to review that, you'll see where fire was used. Well, how is Amos' intercession different this time? It seems very similar. At this time, he asked Yahweh to relent. Last time, he asked Yahweh to forgive Jacob and to relent. Now he simply says relent. He doesn't ask that God forgive the northern kingdom. Evidently, he understood that forgiveness and removal of all judgment was not going to happen. Judgment was inevitable. Remember, the judgment was decreed. Not the form of judgment, but judgment. So far, Amos has intervened on 2 possible forms of judgment. Well, here's a side question. Can you name another prophet who jumped in and spoke during a vision? Remember, this is a vision, a dreamlike state. But Amos is talking during it. Well, if you check out Zechariah 3, you'll find that Zechariah did the same thing. He saw a vision, a courtroom-like scene, and at one point he got so excited, he jumped in and offered his estimate of what should be done next. Well, let's get back to Amos. Was the judgment by fire decreed? That was it fixed? Well, evidently not, because God would not have relented had it been a decree. We know judgment again was decreed, but the form was not. So the statement made, there was no statement made that this would happen. Remember, God still hasn't spoken. He's just showing visions. And Amos responds. Rather than use fire, God moved on to present another method of judgment. But note, Amos acknowledged God's sovereignty, yet he again prayed, evidently believing his prayer might have some effect. How can you explain that? Well, it seems that God's plan for prayer is in some respect inscrutable. We don't know, but yet there are some things we can say. Prayer in Scripture is both a gift to the believer and a command. True prayer seems to change the one who is praying. So there's one of the benefits. It changes the one who prays. By how? By meaningful communication with God. By confirmation to God's ultimate will. You said, okay, Lord, I'll go along with your will. Let me intercede. Let me say this. Let me say that. But I'm going along with your will. By placing your reason in the service of God, you're using your head as well as your spirit to respond to God in prayer. And it increases your awareness of God's providential hand, and it increases your thankfulness when you see God's hand played out in response to your prayer. And it increases your awareness of God's holiness. God is holy. He is other. He's not one of us. Prayer requests don't change God's eternal plan. That's the first thing to recognize. But God does seem to choose to realize some goals through prayer. And we've seen that here with Amos. Twice, Amos has interceded, and God has essentially said, no, I won't do that. But God's got something in mind, and that's going to come up very soon. The birth of John the Baptist was another example of this, of the prayer affecting things. In Isaiah 40, chapter 40, verse 3, I think it is, and in Malachi also 3:1, God foretold his plan in the Old Testament to provide a forerunner for the Messiah. And that forerunner came in response to a prayer. Look at Luke 1:13. But the angel, that's Gabriel, said to him, Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. Remember, these are in their older age, and they thought they were past the normal time for having children. And you are to give him the name John. So John the Baptist was planned way back in the Old Testament, but he was also an answer to the prayers of Zechariah and Elizabeth. So hundreds of years after Amos, a man and wife prayed. God's plan for a forerunner was fulfilled in answer to that prayer. There's possibly another subtle message here. The great deep included the great water, the great subterranean waters beneath the earth's surface, waters that fed the springs in Israel. So that fire would have dried up many water supplies for the state. That would probably bring a drought as well, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. Some in the northern kingdom, interestingly, worshiped the goddess of the great deep. That goddess was named either Rahab or Tiamat, Tiamat. So God may have been telling them, he was telling Amos that he was about to tell them, look, you worship Tiamat, I'll show you her power. I'm going to dry up all the water that she can give you, and she will be powerless. So Yahweh threatened to burn poor Tiamat out of house and home, sending a message to her worshippers that Yahweh was the one true God. So, incidentally, that's not new. Go back to the Exodus again, and you'll recall that God's plagues in Egypt were statements relative to their gods that they worshiped. And he was picking off their gods one by one, says, your God does this, let me show you how powerless he is against my power. Well, let's recheck the visions and proposed judgments in verses 7, 1, and 4. Let's think about this for a minute. What standards were used in each vision to determine the level and distribution of judgment? We're not told of any. Were there some? Probably, but we're not told about them. There seemed to be no mention of a test of the nation. God had already decreed they were going to be judged. Well, that's about to change. In this next vision, vision number 3, there will be a test implied, allowing the possibility then that some in the northern kingdom might pass the test. Perhaps total corporate destruction would not result, even though Israel was to go into exile, and as a nation they would exist no more. But depending upon the test and people's response to it, there could be a remnant surviving that test. Let's look at verses 7, 8, and 9. This is what he showed me. That's the Lord, of course. The Lord was standing by a wall. Interesting. What do you think the Lord looked like to Isaiah, or Amos in this case, rather? Yeah, Isaiah had the same thing. He saw a vision of God. Wonder what God looked like to him. Now, what does the Lord look like here? Evidently, he was standing by a wall, so it probably had some impression of a man-like character standing by a wall. That's interesting, too, because there is a member of the Trinity in both the Old and New Testaments who had the appearance of a man. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus, the Son. Well, the Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to the plumb. The plumb means that the wall was vertical. And he has, and this is the Lord, has a plumb line in his hand. That's a measuring device for checking the verticaliness. Is that a word? Checking to see if the wall is vertical. That is it perfectly upright? And the Lord asked me, what do you see, Amos? And Amos' response evidently is, plumb line. I replied, this is Amos who replied that. Then the Lord said, look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. He's going to check the uprightness of his people. I will spare them no longer. The high places of Isaac, and there's an interesting show, not Jacob this time, Isaac. What does he say? The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. With my sword I will rise against the house of Jeroboam, and that would have been Jeroboam too, the king at that time. Well, this isn't the only time that Yahweh said he would destroy the northern kingdom. A few years later, just before they actually did fall to the Assyrians, we find in Hosea 1:4, and those of you who've been with us for a while know that we looked at Hosea in detail. Hosea 1:4, then the Lord said to Hosea, call him, that's his son, first son by Gomer, Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. So again, later, after this point, God reiterated that this was a decree. Israel will be finished as a nation. By the way, high places that Amos spoke of probably referred to the rural places of worship, probably some altars that are set up in the countryside, and sanctuaries probably referred to the golden calf temples at Bethel and Dan that were established by Jeroboam I, the first king of Israel. In this vision, there is a slight change of form. This time, God spoke to Amos. He hadn't done so, remember, in the first two. For the first time, Amos was formally invited to respond. He wasn't invited before. He just blurted out his intervention or his desire for intervention, intercession. God not only laid out a judgment here, he conducted a test before the judgment. He said, before the judgment takes place, I'm going to put a plumb line for uprightness among the people. But notice, Amos did not intercede as he had the first two times. He knew at this point, evidently, that God would not relent from this judgment, and it would take place. We are now looking at the decree of God, and it evidently says, I'm going to check the uprightness of the people, and there will be some who will survive. And again, I still have a question, what did God look like in that vision? And again, can you relate it to the Trinity? I think I did in saying that I believe what he saw was a vision of the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, also known as the angel of Jehovah. That same question could be asked in the case of Isaiah's vision of God. It was in Isaiah 6. Remember, he saw God high and lifted up, fell on his face, and he said, oh, woe is me. But interestingly, in that case, if you look at John 12:41, John tells you he saw the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Funny, isn't it, how often Malach Yahweh seems to appear in these various books and in various ways. By the way, what does the name Isaac mean? Yeah, everybody knows it means laughter, because Sarah laughed when God told Abraham she would have a child because of her age. So let me ask you this, could God be using Isaac as a name for Israel, as he did here, to show them what he thought of their religious and political structures. Remember, none of the kingdom, the northern kingdom, southern kingdom, the whole nation, is never called the house of Isaac. Because remember, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, but Jacob was the chosen one. Esau was not under the covenant. So Isaac had created or been the head of two different sets of people, the Jews eventually and the Edomites. So his house included those who were not Jews. Jacob, however, his 12 sons were all under the covenant. So all of Jacob's progeny down the line are under the covenant. So this is the only place in Scripture, by the way, where Isaac is used as a synonym or name for Israel. That's a question, and I've asked it before many times, and I just did again a moment ago, that Israel is never called the house of Isaac because he had sons and offspring who were not under the covenant. The same is true of Abraham, by the way. But Israel is called the house of Jacob because he had only Jewish offspring. Of course, they weren't called Jews early on. They were called Israelites. Hebrews first, then Israelites after the Exodus. Well, let's get back to Amos a minute. Walls in those days were built of stone without mortar. The plumb line was the measuring device to check to see if the wall was vertical, upright. And the stones this verticality test had two different purposes. One is to keep a wall upright as it's being built, and the other is to test an existing wall to see if it needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Because without a foundation to the wall could get out of kilter. So what does the vision seem to imply that this plumb line measures? Well, I think it's uprightness. That's why I think it relates to the notion of a remnant of true believers, even in the northern kingdom. From verse 8, let me ask you a question there as well. What does the fact that Amos offered no intercessory prayer imply? Well, we've actually said we believe that he came to know that God had decreed this particular method to set up his judgment, and that he wasn't going to relent again, so there was no need for him to intervene. It wouldn't have been done him any good. And by the way, if you look at Jeremiah, I think at least 3 times Jeremiah was told by God, do not pray for this. In other words, he was telling Jeremiah, look, this is fixed. Keep your mouth shut. Don't try to intercede. He did that 3 times, and maybe I'll recall, as we go through, I'll recall where that is in Jeremiah. As a matter of fact, let me think about it now. I think Jeremiah 6, 11, and 14. Somewhere in those 3 chapters, Jeremiah chapter 6, or chapter 7 rather, chapter 11, chapter 14, you will find that the prophet was told, don't try interceding. I have fixed this in my mind. It is decreed. It will happen. So God had built Israel as a plumb line within the covenant. What were God's plumb lines? The plumb line of his love, the plumb line of his law, and they were used to call Israel to be holy. Remember, a holy nation, a holy priesthood, much like the church is called in, what is it, 1 Peter. If you look at 1 Peter chapter 2, you will find that Peter reiterates almost everything that was said of Israel during the Exodus and afterwards about their choice, God's election of them. You'll find that same set of descriptions applied to the church by Peter in chapter 2 of 1 Peter. If this vision said that God's own people would be judged for falling short of proper covenant behavior, what might it mean for the church today? Ever think of that? Well, judgment begins with God's people. Judgment begins in the house of the Lord. So judgment will begin, I think, with the church. And I believe we're seeing that time fast approaching. Well, from verse 9, did God said he would kill Jeroboam 2 by this Jeroboam, not Jeremiah, Jeroboam 2 by the sword? Not directly. He said that he'd send the sword against the house of Jeroboam 2, speaking of Jeroboam's dynasty, but not necessarily about Jeroboam himself. Next session, that's going to come up as an issue. This vision seems to say that God's judgment on Israel was not only for and on the people and the nation, it included the political institutions as well. In our next session, by the way, we'll see that the separation of church and state did not exist in that time in Israel in the northern kingdom. We'll save some of these answers for next time. Let me quickly give you some takeaways. Revelation is God's initiative. He determines what he's going to reveal and when he'll reveal it. Uprightness is a protection against judgment and discipline. Prayer changes things as a part of God's plan. It doesn't change God's plan, but it changes things, and that's the way God has designed it. Prayer is one important ingredient in spiritual growth. As an assignment before next time, let me ask you this. Find all of the names, all of the synonyms used of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom not being one of them. How many different names can you find that represent the northern kingdom? Try to find at least 5. Well, in our next session, we're going to move on to the 4th of Amos's 5 visions. But it's going to come after something very interesting. See you then.